Hello everybody, welcome back to episode 8 of Creating Dark Souls in Unity. So today we're going to handle loading weapons in our hands. First, we have to make a new script. We're going to call that script item. And this will act as the base class for all items in our game. So let's open that up. We're going to need to make this a scriptable object. So I'm just going to put my namespace in there and delete everything inside. I'm going to make a header called item information. So after we turn this into a scriptable object, we're going to think, what are all of our items going to have? Well, every item is going to have a sprite for our UI. So we're going to make a public sprite and just call that item icon. And then every item in our game is going to have a name. So we're going to say public string item name. And we're going to save that. Just close out all these other scripts here so we're not confused. Okay, next we're going to create another script. And we're going to call this one weapon item. Now this is going to be a script that is going to inherit the properties of our item script. So we're just going to come in here, erase the start and update method, throw down our namespace as per usual. Now we're going to give this model behavior and we're going to put item here. So it's going to inherit all the variables from our item script. We also need to make it so you can create this in our game. So we're going to say create asset menu. We're going to say menu name is equal to, I'm going to place items / weapon item. Alright, so what are weapon items going to have? Well, they're going to have a game object, which is going to be our model. That'll be the weapons prefabbed model. And for now, that's all we need, but I am going to place down a public pool, and I'm going to name that isUnarmed. And in the future, this is how we're going to handle our unarmed weapon. But for now, it's not too important. Alright guys, next let's drag in any weapon that you may have. I'm going to use a weapon called Sword 01. So after we drag that in, we're going to need to make that into a prefab. So I'm just going to drag it into the scene here. Take a look at it if you guys want to see it. And then I'm going to full screen my Unity again. I'm just going to drag this back out of the scene and create an original prefab. Alright, so I need to get some organization happening here. So I'm going to go into my art and I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this models. I'm going to place my player model folder in there and my weapon model. Alright, perfect. Now I'm going to make another folder. I'm going to call this data. And I'm going to make a subfolder in here. I'm going to call this prefabs. And then I'm going to make another folder and call this weapons. It's best to stay organized, especially early into your project, because things can get very messy and hectic later if you don't. So I'm going to drag my weapon prefab in there, and I'm going to take this out of the scene. Okay, awesome. Now, so we're going to right click in here in the data folder, and we're going to create another folder, and we're going to call this items. I'm going to go in here, we're going to right click again, create a folder, and call this one weapons. Excellent. So let's go inside here, right click, create items, weapon item. So you should be able to create one of these if you've done the scripts correctly up to this point. We're going to call this sword. I'm going to go up here to our item name and fill in sword. Not that it matters right now, but just to be neat. Next we're going to find our prefab and drag it in there. I've placed mine in the data, prefabs, and weapons folder. So I'm just going to drag mine on in here to the model prefab variable, and we're good to go. I hope you guys don't hear too much background noise. There's some loud stuff going on outside. Alright, so let's go back to assets, right click, we're going to say create, and we're going to make another C# script. And we're going to call this weapon holder slot. So what this is going to do is control where the weapon is instantiated on our hands. So basically where the model will appear on our hands. We're going to knock out the start and update method, and we're going to place our namespace as is tradition. So what we're going to need first in this script is a transform, where the weapon is going to be instantiated. So we're going to say public transform, we're going to call this parent override. Next, we're going to need a bool for is left or is right. So we're going to say public pool is left hand slot, and then public pool is right hand slot. Excellent. Okay, next we're going to say public game object, current weapon model. And this is going to be a variable for our current model that's in our hands. Alright, now we need to create a function to handle loading the weapon model on our hands. So, let's create a public void load weapon model. Then we're going to need a weapon item, and we're going to call that weapon item. Straightforward. Alright, so we need some thinking here. We're going to say if weapon item equals null, we're going to want to unload the weapon model and then return. Basically, if the weapon item being passed is null, non-existent, we're going to want to unload whatever we have in our hand and then return. So when we start this function, we also want to unload the weapon and destroy. So basically, when we're loading a new model, we want to destroy the old one that's in our hand when we switch weapons in the future. So game object model equals instantiate weapon item dot model prefab, because we added a variable called model prefab on our weapon item. So we're going to instantiate that as game object. If model does not equal null, if parent override does not equal null, so if you have a parent override, we're going to say model.transform.parent equals parent override. Now if there is no parent override, we're going to say model.transform.parent equals transform. And put simply, that means the transform is equal to the transform of this script. Next, we're going to say model.transform.local position is equal to vector3.0. It's important you say local position and not just position. Next, model.transform.local rotation is equal to quaternion identity. Again, it's important that you say local rotation and not just rotation. And lastly, model.transform.local scale is equal to vector3.1. So regardless of where you are parented, we're still going to do all three of these things. And then lastly, we're going to say current weapon model is equal to model. And we're going to save that. Okay, next, we are going to need to make two more functions. The first one being unload weapon. So this one's very straightforward. We're just going to say if current weapon model does not equal null, current weapon model dot set active false. Then we're going to come down here into our first function, and we're going to place that right here. Next, we're going to say public void unload weapon and destroy. And for this one, we're going to say if current weapon model does not equal null, we're going to say destroy current weapon model. Then we're going to come down here and we're going to place that right at the top. And that's it for the script. We are done the weapon holder slot script. So let's save that. Now let's get back in Unity. Okay guys, next we gotta find the actual transform of our character's hands, because that is where we're going to instantiate the weapon. So you're probably gonna find that somewhere in a place that looks something like this. Now go down to your left and right hand. We're after both, so I'm just gonna make both visible right here. Now starting with the right hand, I'm gonna click on that, and I'm going to add the script weapon holder slot onto the hand. Now, I'm going to tick his right hand slot because this is on the right hand. Just to be safe, I'm going to drag the right hand's transform onto the parent override. Next, I'm going to go to the left hand, I'm going to add that script and do the same, except I'm not going to drag that in the parent override. but I'm going to tick is left hand. I'm actually going to create a new empty game object and call this left hand override. And this will make sense very shortly. So I'm going to drag that new empty game object up there, and that will be the parent override. Let's create a new script. Let's call this Weapon Slot Manager. So we're going to open this up. Let's get rid of the start and the update function. Let's go up here and throw down our namespace. Now we're going to need two things here. We're going to need both the left hand and right hand weapon slot. So let's make a variable, weapon holder slot. We're going to call this one left hand slot. Let's make another variable, weapon holder slot, right hand slot. Now you could make these public and drag them in, but we're going to handle it a little bit more elegantly than that. So let's call on the awake method. We're going to use a for each loop here. So we're going to say weapon holder slot, and we're going to use an array. We're going to call it weapon holder slots is equal to get components in children, weapon holder slot. Because this script is going to sit on the player's player model. And when this is on awake, it's going to search the player model for the two weapon holder slots. But now, we're going to use a for each loop here to basically determine which slot is the left hand and which slot is the right hand. So for each weapon holder slot, we're just going to say weapon slots. In weapon holder slots, if weapon slot dot is left hand slot equals weapon slot. So when it searches these weapon holder slots, if it finds that one of them has the left hand slot option ticked, it will assign it to our left hand slot variable. Else if weapon slot dot is right handed slot, then we're going to say right hand slot equals weapon slot. So yeah, this is just going to search down through our player model for the weapon slot scripts, and then it's going to assign them in the left and right variables depending on what bool we checked. That's great because now you don't have to drag it in or make the variables public. So we're going to make a public void load weapon on slot. We're going to say we need a weapon item, and we're going to need a bool for is left. And this means, is it loading on the left hand or is it not? And if it's not, it's obviously loading on the right hand. So very straightforward. We're going to say if is left, left hand slot dot load weapon model, pass the weapon item. Perfect. We're going to say else. So if it's not the left, it must be right. Whoops, I don't need the if is right there. We're going to say right hand slot dot load weapon model weapon item. Excellent. Let's save that. Okay guys, we're almost done. So I'm just going to add this weapon slot manager script onto my player here. And I'm going to add it to the player model, not on the empty player game object. So it's going to sit on the same place as my animation handler. So we only need to make one more script. It's going to be for our player's inventory. So this will handle all future item pickups and organization of equipment, etc., etc. So right click create, C# scripts, player inventory. Let's double click that and open it up. So let's get rid of the start and update method and put our namespace down as is per usual. Now we're not going to add a whole lot to the inventory in this episode. We're going to keep it pretty basic for now and just load the weapons. So we're going to say public weapon item. We're going to say we need one for right hand weapon or just right weapon, and then public weapon item for left weapon. So this means what weapons are currently in our right and left hand. We're going to do an awake. First, we need to call upon our weapon manager. So up here, we're going to say weapon slot manager weapon slot manager. And remember, we put that in the component below the player empty game object. So we're going to say weapon slot manager get component in children, because I'm placing this script on top where the input handler and player manager is. Let's save that. And now we're going to do something on start too. After we've found the script, just going to go down here and create the start method. I'm going to say weapon slot manager dot load weapon on slot. Then we'll start with the right weapon, and since it's the right hand, we're going to say false. It is not left. Then we're going to do the same and say weapon slot manager dot load weapon on slot left weapon, and then it will be true because it is on the left slot. Alright, let's save that. Okay, now let's assign the player inventory script on our player. And after we do that, we're going to assign our sword in our player's left and right hand. It's important to assign it in the left and right now for the demonstration. Now, with the way we're loading the model into the player's hands, our model is actually going to be 1% of its regular size, which is why we need to make some edits to the prefab. That's okay, because we have to create an empty object on the prefab. I'll show you what I mean. So let's just take the prefab here and drag it into the scene. And let's create an empty game object under it so it has the same transform. And then we're going to drag that game object out, but first we have to unpack the prefab. So let's just call this sword, or whatever you want, whatever your weapon's name is going to be. Right click, create empty, and call this weapon pivot. Then drag the sword under the weapon pivot. Okay, now overwrite your old prefab with this. So next let's click on the prefab and open it up. We're going to go down to our weapon pivot, and we're going to make the scale of it 100 by 100 by 100. Alright, now you can delete this sword from the scene. And with that, let's just check down here. Yeah, we should be ready to go. I'm just going to check on the sword scriptable object here and make sure the model is still on it. And it is. Okay, perfect. Let's hit play. And there it is. The sword's loaded on our hands, but as you can see, they're kind of not where you want them to sit. So we're going to fix that right now. Now, pause the game and click on the sword. You want to find the right hand first, not the left. This is important. The right hand first. So let's go in here and open it up. And you see how our sword is there, and we can now click on our weapon pivot. And what you're going to want to do is edit the weapon so it's where you want it. Make sure you're editing the weapon pivot and not the weapon itself. This is very important. So after you got it right where you wanted, right click on the transform of the weapon pivot and click copy component. Okay? And then we're going to get out of the game here. Go to your sword prefab, not the weapon, but the prefab itself of the model. Open it up, click on the weapon pivot, and paste your transform values in there. And then get back out of the prefab here and load the scene in again. And there you have it, the sword loads where you want it to. Now, I'm not really satisfied with that result, so I'm just going to do one further edit real quick before we continue. And perfect, okay. Now, the left hand is similar, but we're not going to edit the left hand's weapon pivot because that would change the right hand's weapon pivot also. We're going to edit the left hand override. So you can see now why we didn't drag the left hand in there, because then we'd be changing the rotation of our, or the transform of our character's hand. But instead we're changing the empty game object, the override. And now the weapon will load on that override, just like that. Now before we stop, we're going to want to copy the left hand override's transform, like we did with the weapon pivot. And then make sure you stop the game. And then go to your model, and then right click and paste it in the left hand override. Now I'll repeat again, if we had to just grab the weapon on the left hand and edit the weapon pivot on the left hand, it would have changed the pivot for the right hand too, because it's the same weapon. And there we go, we are now holding two weapons. And that's pretty cool. If you made it this far, give yourself a pat on the back, good job. Now in the next episode, we'll talk about how we can actually implement some idling animations so we don't look so silly with them when we walk. And we'll get into attacking and all that fun stuff real soon. But before I go, I'd like to address something. A certain commenter of ours found that we have a bug. If we hold shift while standing in place, we actually play the sprinting animation. And that is a very quick and easy fix, which I will address in the next video. But if you want to go ahead and tackle it yourself, I'll give you a hint. It has to do with when we allow our sprint bool to be true. Alright guys, be sure to drop a like as it does help appease the YouTube algorithm gods, which does help me out quite a bit. Also, if you want to be super kind, you can leave a comment, let me know how your project's going, let me know if you got any questions, etc, etc. And if you're feeling super generous, you could support me by checking out my Patreon down below. With that being said, I will see you guys in the next episode. And of course, before I step out, thank you to Nico, Simon, Steven, and TTH for their support on Patreon.